Now in this chapter, let's look at just some use cases when it comes to migrating workloads. So let's look at an example of a .NET application and a Cassandra database. So let's say a company has a Microsoft .NET application, and this application uses Cassandra as the data layer. Now they want to migrate this entire architecture onto AWS. Now they want to minimize the administrative overhead in managing the solutions when they move onto AWS. And they don't even mind making code changes if required to meet the migration requirements. So what would be a typical solution? Now, should we move the application onto EC2 instances? Well, this is not an ideal scenario. So this would involve administrative overheads. And from the question, it mentions that they want to move onto AWS and ensure that they have the least administrative overheads. Could they move the application to Elastic Beanstalk? Well, this is an ideal solution. So remember, Elastic Beanstalk supports .NET, and Elastic Beanstalk can provision the entire environment for you. What about moving Cassandra data onto DynamoDB? Well, you can do this as well. So in the use case scenario, they said that they don't mind making any code changes to ensure that they have a managed environment in AWS. And since DynamoDB is a completely managed solution, you can go ahead and use DynamoDB. You can also go ahead and use the AWS database migration utility to migrate the database itself. And you can also use the AWS schema conversion tool to migrate the schema between database engines. Let's take another use case scenario, migrating documents. Now let's say a company has a large set of documents that need to be migrated onto AWS. Now they need a data store unit to be in place in AWS that's highly available and scalable. The data must be encrypted at rest and in transit, and the company wants to ensure that they can manage the encryption keys. So would moving to EC2 instances with EBS volumes be an ideal solution? You could actually store the documents on EBS volumes, but this is not cost effective. And you would manually need to increase the storage and manage the high availability. What about using Amazon DynamoDB? Well, remember, this is not a data store for documents. What about using Amazon S3? Yes, this is the perfect place to store your documents. You can also use the AWS Key Management Service to manage the encryption keys. Let's look at another use case scenario, migrating large databases. So now let's say a company has an on-premise database. The database is of 10 TB of size. The database is a PostgreSQL database. Now the company has 50 MB internet connection link. This is being used via a VPN connection to a VPC. Now they want to migrate the database onto AWS securely and reliably, and the cutover must be done within a week's time. Now from a nodes perspective, understand that the database is large, it's 10 TB in size, and trying to transfer this data onto an internet connection may not be the ideal scenario, because here the internet connection is not so big. And normally transferring such a large database over a VPN is not reliable. And another important point is that we do have a week's time to migrate. So should we think of using the AWS database migration service to migrate the entire database? Well, not so. That's because of the limited bandwidth connection. What about using the AWS Snowball device? Yes, that's perfect. We can actually take the backup of the entire database using native tools and take an initial load of the data onto S3 using the AWS Snowball device. We can then import the data from S3 onto an Amazon RDS instance, so we can spin up a PostgreSQL instance in AWS RDS. And then finally, we can use the AWS database migration service to replicate all the Delta changes. Right, so just some use case scenarios to get into your head on migrating workloads onto AWS.
For more details, check the link in the description. Learn with Whizlabs. Success certified.